From LPM,
Louisville Public Media.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson. Welcome to Race Unwrapped, a podcast unwrapping all the ways race affects our world, whether we're thinking about it or not. My guest this episode is Steve Bien-Aimé, Assistant Professor of Journalism at Northern Kentucky University. This episode, we're going to talk about compliments that can get the side eye, depending on who they're directed at. You've probably heard them, words like articulate, well-spoken. The sentence always has a second half that stays unspoken, but still gets heard loud and clear. We'll unwrap it on this episode of Race Unwrapped. My guest this episode is Steve Bien-Aimé, Assistant Professor of Journalism at Northern Kentucky University. And we're going to talk about that real tricky compliment, articulate.
My name is Steve Bien-Aimé. I'm an assistant professor in the communication department at Northern Kentucky University. I research race and gender portrayals in news and sports media, as well as diversity issues in a wider context. And for point of background, I have a PhD in mass communications, and I worked as a journalist for a number of years. So I bring a mix of industry knowledge and academic knowledge into this conversation today.
So the word that you and I are going to discuss, which on the surface may not seem like such a bad word, which is why it can be a controversial word, is the word when it comes to talking about Black people. And there's certain corollaries to other races that aren't white. But with Black people, the word articulate. The number of times that a Black person who is well-spoken is considered articulate, and some would go, well, why is that a problem? And it's like, because usually when you're saying that someone's articulate, you're usually saying it as if that's a surprise.
Yes, and I think that there's a lot here to unpack. So from my research perspective and what I do in different diversity trainings, who gets to define who's well-spoken and who is not? Mm-hmm. Who gets to define who is articulate and who is not? And I think we have to start from there. For those who are very interested in this topic, my former graduate school colleague, Chinchirai Kumanika, who's now a professor at Rutgers, talked about the NPR voice maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and how there can be at times a certain bias toward how a specific person should sound on TV or should sound on radio. So we need to break down first who gets to say whose diction is correct, and then we can, I think, roll into a discussion of why is it at times an issue to call certain racial minority groups articulate, if that makes sense, Michelle.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. It reminds me, I've heard people talk about NPR's political reporter. I'm blanking on her last name, Aisha. What is Aisha's last? Oh, Aisha Roscoe, right? And Raska, and how because her diction doesn't have this white middle class, middle ground sort of, regionless sound to it, and you clearly can tell that she's Black or African American if you prefer. There's been times when apparently she's been criticized for that, as if what she's doing and what she is saying is any less professionally sound than someone who has, a sound that, again, you could not pin to anything or anybody.
And I think this is a very key point. And so when we say that sounds odd to us, I'm speaking of as a generic individual. What we're not questioning is the lack of representation that led us to this assumption. Mm-hmm. So because you didn't have or we still don't have a huge range of voices and sounds, right? We're not talking, when you talk, I love the word used, regionless,
Yeah.
right? How many
Right.
people how many people do we hear with a very hard Southern drawl? How many people do we
Exactly.
hear with a very hard Boston accent, right? I come from the Philadelphia area, right? So Wooder, Whudder, right? I don't say and so these are things that that come about. So what tends to happen is we don't question as a society what is currently the norm. Oh, this is the way it's always been.
Mm-hmm.
Well, who got to pick whose voices were on the radio?
Mm-hmm.
Who got to pick how people were depicted? And so when we're saying someone doesn't sound, again, articulate or erudite, it's because it's already been programmed into us what that manifestation should be.
And people also don't realize, I think, the well-meaning biases that are still biases, right? So it reminds me of when I first came into radio just a few years ago, and I was a reporter in Kansas City, where I am from, and I had the criticism the first, 2 or 3 times that I didn't sound like myself on the radio. And I'm like, "What do you mean I don't sound like myself? I mean, who else could I sound like? I mean, that was me speaking." And and I had my best friend who is also black, also has the same educational background as I do. I'm a former attorney. She's a current attorney. She's black. And so I said, "Okay, could you listen to this? What does it mean? Does this sound like me?" And she goes, "Of course it sounds like you. It sounds like Michelle, the educated Michelle that you are, that I assume that's who they hired. If what they want is homegirl Michelle, that's not who they hired." So if they think that I'm gonna go on the air and be like, "Hey, what's up? So today," I mean, it's just they meant well in saying I needed to sound more like myself, but how I'm speaking even casually to coworkers isn't gonna be what I sound like when I voice a story.
And I think that this also needs to be teased out because we sound different, and we meaning all people.
Mm-hmm.
So if I put somebody from Louisville, regardless of race, and said, hey, you're going to your family cookout, so you have like 40 of your relatives there,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to talk differently than when you talk when you're in the classroom. And you're
Right.
going to talk differently when you're in the workplace. So this idea of a code switching
Oh,
or
code switching.
something
Mm-hmm.
like that is occurring. And when I mentioned a couple minutes ago about various forms of representation, for a lot of marginalized groups, so we can put race in there, depending on the different types of marginalization, we could talk region, class, you often get one representation or one dominant perspective. And so what happens is like the affectation you are giving off, well, that's Michelle. It's like, well, that may not be Michelle, but
Right.
all the people who are like Michelle are like that. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, no. And what we need to do is step back and ask ourselves, how did we get to an understanding that once you hear the word all, you need to always pause.
Right.
But when you hear all the people who are like this are supposed to sound like that, are we basing this on firsthand information? Did we grab all the, I think for Black Americans, we're talking what, 15 million, 16?
Mm-hmm.
No, it's more than that, 30 million people. If you're saying all 30 million people are going to sound like something, right? And so we need to really step back and challenge that, because are we trying to replicate a stereotype or a predetermined picture of what something should be, instead of allowing multiple authentic experiences to show through?
But what it also boils down to is that people's biases about how folks are supposed to sound, in my opinion, come from their not knowing the damn thing about the people and how they're supposed to sound, right? So And people go, well, he doesn't sound black. Well, what do you mean he doesn't sound black? He's black. So if he's black, however he sounds is black. But if you only have watched, black people through TV screens or through movie screens, then your concept of what black sounds like is very narrow. I thought about this and I thought about our upcoming talk today because this weekend I'm 20 years late, but I just started watching The Wire. Everybody's always saying, Michelle, The Wire, The Wire. I've been hearing that for 20 years. I finally have HBO on my cable and I've started watching. And I thought to myself, so this is a very interesting show in terms of the quote unquote black dialect. So you've got the people who are in drugs who are black and sound a certain way. And in the ears of most people, that's how black people sound, right? But then you have the black attorney, the black police detective, and they sound different. They sound distinctly different. And one could probably argue that some people, including some black people, would say, oh, they're the ones who sound white. They're educated, so they sound white. And it's like, that's that whole thing that we grapple with, even within the race, right?
Exactly. And so we have to ask ourselves, how did we arrive at this is how somebody sounds? And as you pointed out, firsthand experiences are critical when thinking about stereotypes. And this is why so many groups seek representation and make that a big deal. If all you have is one representation of yourself on the news or in journalism or on the radio, then people perceive that's the way your group is, because most people lack genuine firsthand interactions with a wide range of people.
Yep.
And so we would say it's mediated, right? It's through TV, it's through radio, so on and so forth. And so if we were to say, well, they don't sound black, well, would the person who said, and this can be internalized, right? As you pointed out, even some black people.
Oh, yeah.
Would we say Frederick Douglass is not black? Would we say that W.E.B. Du Bois or Dubois, if you're a Francophile, is not black, right? Would we say that Thurgood Marshall is not black? And everybody would say, of course not.
Right.
These were some of the most eloquent, right? Langston Hughes, right? These are some of the most eloquent black American writers, black male American writers.
Right.
Let me check myself here.
I was about to say, you're good, because I was about to check you, but you checked yourself, so we good.
And this is something, this is a consistent battle for me as an aside, where we have to always check our privileges and our biases, and we all have them.
Oh, yeah.
And that doesn't make you a bad person.
Nope, not at all.
It's how often am I in touch with my bias and my understandings of the world, and how can I more accurately articulate my position to reflect my bias?
Right.
Without erasing the experiences of so many other people. So anyway, to bring this back, we have a strong tradition of myriad groups, from the north and the south, from suburbs to urban to rural, who speak and write both differently and beautifully and can articulate their experiences and how they perceive the world so well. You don't need to be Jay-Z. You don't need to be, if you're a child from the 80s, it's not Run DMC. Like, these are all, that's one representation of many, right? And when we hear the word, and I'll bring it back to articulate, when we hear the word something like articulate, it's like the purpose of communication is to get your message across, right?
Right.
Well, if people are getting their message across, then it's articulate, right? You can understand it.
Absolutely. Right.
And I think what tends to occur, and you mentioned the word surprise. Well, that person is articulate. Well, they go to school,
Right.
and they see, and this is something very critical for the listeners of this program. And I mentioned code switching a few minutes ago. There are certain rules that you have in different spaces, right? For those people who are, of your listeners who are religious, right? I know a lot of people, once they enter a house of worship, their language changes dramatically,
Right.
right? Some four-letter words don't come out of your mouth, and
Their Saturday night language changes to Sunday morning language. Exactly.
there you go, there you go. And so you wouldn't be shocked at, oh my God, so-and-so cusses a lot, but they don't cuss here. Well, the same can be said, and you mentioned your own experience, Michelle, where, oh yeah, when I go to the office, I talk like this, or if I'm going to the courthouse or the courtroom, I'm going to talk like this. What? Just because somebody can do something like you can, don't be surprised at it, because they have the same, not the same, but they've taken English classes. They've taken, I think they still teach phonics and composition.
Right.
But this part is the critical part for your listeners, and people might be asking, well, why is Michelle talking about this from the lens of race? And it is, how often would we say, oh my goodness, that for the purposes of this example, right? That white person is just so erudite, so articulate. We don't often use this language. And let me put a narrow boat. Let's say a white middle class person from the suburbs, because like when I taught in the South, in Louisiana at LSU, often my students also would get this, regardless of color, about being articulate or how well they can speak.
Because Southern white people can relate to this very well, probably.
Correct. And again, this is why we're when we talk about checking ourselves and making sure we get the point clear, we're trying to. I think the way you said it earlier, Michelle, with this regionalist affectation is good. But how many times would we say that? Like when Barack Obama was running for office, oh my God, he speaks so well.
The number of people who said that. Well, and let me interrupt you. I also want to.
Go ahead.
I also want to make the distinction that there is a difference between someone saying someone articulated that well, right? Like they took a complicated, complex topic, issue, whatever, and they articulated that well. That is a different commentary than saying that someone's sound is articulate because they don't sound. The best example I can think of is a friend of mine years ago. I've lost touch with her, but she was a TV reporter in Austin. We worked together in Austin. I was a newspaper reporter. She's black. She was a TV reporter, and she was telling me the story about how one of her white news directors or something came through the room when a black woman journalist was on national TV. I don't even remember who it was because it's irrelevant for the point. And he just paused and goes, "She just sounds so articulate." And my friend goes, "Well, I would hope that," and I'm just throwing out a station call numbers, because I would hope that a national ABC reporter would sound articulate. I mean, like he didn't even realize what he said. You know what I mean? That he was commenting. He was commenting on how a national professional TV reporter sounded articulate. Like, back to your point, in a way he would not have said if Walter Cronkite or fill in the blank or Brian Williams is on the air.
And I think there's 2 points that I just want to partner with yours. One, if you're expressing that much surprise, this means that you probably didn't want to hire this person in the first place, right? When we talk about issues of why aren't people getting hired, promoted, or staying in the industry, if you're making people feel less than who have full qualification, why would they want to work with you, for you, so on and so forth? Right? They wouldn't go to you and say, "Oh my," that same news director, "Oh my God, can you believe so and so in that meeting was able to get his words out? Like, that's expected.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the second part, when you mentioned Walter Cronkite, right? This comes back to one of my original statements about who sets the standard. Well, if they put somebody else on TV first or on the radio first, you would say, oh, they should sound like so and so. So I look at this from sports, right? When we see a lack of representation for women, and often, or it's often male, I guess, like I'll call them like Twitter, quote unquote Twitter experts, more Twitter trolls. Oh, I don't like the way so and so announcer sounds.
Oh yeah.
And what they're articulating is, I'm used to a certain sounding person, and so now you're adding somebody new. I don't like it, not based upon the qualifications of somebody new or how well they can talk, but they're different. And
exactly.
So when we say somebody is articulate, are we also trying to say that person sounds like something that makes me comfortable, right? And so, and who's it making comfortable? The people who created the initial system, or people who like the initial system.
Exactly, and then it ends up becoming a generational thing.
I think it's important for you to mention these great points, because I think for a lot of your listeners, there's going to be a lot of, I need to stop and think about that. And we all need to do this because of the different biases that we hold and carry. So something else that we need to think about is like, checking ourselves when we think about words like articulate, but at the same time, we also have to think about, and this is something I write about, research about, and do trainings about, is being inclusive. If I'm holding someone at arm's length and I'm like, oh, that person has all the qualifications I do and they have subject-verb agreement. Well, does that mean then that I thought this person was incompetent to start with? I have and I've worked in regional newsrooms, statewide newsrooms, and national newsrooms. I never worked different sexes, different race and ethnicity, different age groups. And I never sat there and was like, oh my goodness, so-and-so can write a sentence. Like this, that's, you're coming in and it's like, hey, we have to tell stories here. We have to make sure that we are competing with all the other news outlets. If you're surprised at basic competence, think about this. How many opportunities did you not give someone to advance themselves?
Absolutely.
And so when we look at the lack of, again, because this is in my research area, the lack of women and racial and ethnic minorities in C-suite positions. So C-suite meaning the senior management, upper level, the power brokers on Wall Street and corporate America. And we see the paucity of folks, women, and people of color in those spaces. Now think about the power of articulate. Well, that person might have had to take, I'm just throwing out a hypothetical figure.
Right.
They took a year just to prove they were articulate. Well, that's a year just to prove a basic competence, while somebody else at the same level got put on some project or is being sent to a conference that can get them more time with senior leadership or put with influential clients. All of a sudden, this bias, which doesn't look very sinister, has very real, and I'm not trying to say the bias is sinister, but it has very real implications.
But after a point, especially when it happens over the course of someone's career, maybe the intention wasn't sinister, but the overall impact might as well be sinister.
Correct.
Because it gets back to, because what you're articulating, in my opinion, is what I always say, and people should be very uncomfortable about what I'm about to say because it's the truth. I don't care how liberal a white person you are. I don't care how much work you think you've done. I don't think if you think you've been woke all night long, you have an affirmative action bias where whenever you even so much as interview a person of color, you always hold them to the standard of, well, we got to make sure that nobody thinks that this is just an affirmative action hire. So the person walking in the door has to be quote unquote articulate, usually have, if not the background for that job, some other impressive background that makes them go, well, okay, in a way that is doesn't go away. I mean, I'm in my 50s. You know, I am on my second, third, fourth career, depending on how you count. And I never quite feel as if I've gotten over that hump. Now, it gets blurred together because the older you get and the more experience you have and the more impressive experience you have, it gets hard to parse out what is you just being an impressive person that, gets the job versus what is I have to be hyper impressive because I'm black. I mean, but I think that's where articulate comes into play, don't you think?
Well, I think it comes to anybody who is not in the dominant structure, or if you don't have the quote unquote right pedigree, then you have to demonstrate so many more competencies. So something that we talk about in diversity research is the more objective criteria that you meet. Now you have to meet what they call more ad hoc or hidden criteria. Okay, so person X has the college degree. Well, did they get the right internship? Yeah, they did. Then did they meet this? Then did they meet that? And so this is where articulate comes in. You, instead of sort of a blanket assumption that if you have all this criteria, you should be able to have subject-verb agreement and use words that some folks may look up in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. It's now like shocked or a shocking thing for some people. And these biases hold in so many areas. With race, it can hold with and I'm sure that for your listeners, people are going to say, well, I've written about this for Conscious Style Guide, it's a great resource for those looking for inclusive language, about the bias between people who have a high school education compared to people with a college education and how they're portrayed or viewed. People can speak well if this is the metric we're using, right? Follow the formal grammar rules without necessarily having a high school education, a college education, or a post undergrad degree. But we hold these biases and assumptions, not we being society as a whole. So we have to really be cognizant of that. And as you said, it's not a matter of wokeness. It's a matter of awareness of ourselves. And how many of our biases can we be aware of will help us be more inclusive, because we'll know how to treat people better and how to, I think, make a more equitable playing field for more people. Because I think a lot of times folks will look at an unequal outcome, and then they'll say, well, I'm a very nice person, so it can't be anything I'm doing that's leading to an unequal outcome.
Right.
Well, one of my old mentors, he told me that if you have a bad outcome, you have a bad process. So if your process is informed by your biases, then your process is going to lead to an inequitable situation. And so when you're thinking about, and I'll bring it back to articulate, if you're shocked that a coworker is articulate and part of the primary job is already to do this, This is a great example. If I'm hiring a plumber and I'm surprised that the plumber knows how to use a wrench, I think I need to really stop and ask myself, why did I assume, why am I surprised that the plumber can do a basic function?
Right. Why am I impressed that the plumber can use a wrench? Exactly. Right.
And so if I'm watching a television program and I'm watching a broadcast journalist, and this broadcast journalist can do what we call in the business like a 90-second package. This is a very basic function. I can teach that to our introductory students. If you can do a basic function that's what you were hired to do. The moment that I'm shocked by this, that means then that I'm probably holding an assumption against perhaps people from that school, that ethnicity, maybe that region. And something else to consider, the people that I'm not calling articulate or surprised by, how many of them am I giving additional chances or opportunities to that are perhaps unearned or undeserved?
That is the story of the American workplace for people of color. Exactly. Versus the assumptions that people make if you look and sound the right way. So as we're wrapping up this conversation, and I think we're almost done, but something that I really want to just have people sort of think about, and I want your opinion on this, is so this weekend I was watching Saturday Night Live, and Keegan-Michael Key was the guest host. Black man, one would say when he's speaking in his normal voice, he's articulate,
And a fellow Penn State alum like me.
Okay. Shout out to Penn State. And so what I thought was interesting, and I didn't think about this until later. So if I'm not thinking about this till later, that means that a lot of people aren't thinking about it at all, is that his quote unquote funniest sketches was when he was talking in what is perceived as a stereotypical black voice. So it's like, ha 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 ha. Oh, he's talking like an uneducated black man at the high school graduation where they're cheering on their kid who's walking across stage. Oh, he's talking like, a musclehead, uneducated black man, security guard, throwing out the Muppets. I mean, it wasn't until later that I thought that's funny to people because the black man who can speak well is speaking in stereotype. Oh, how funny is that? And I just think that is something that I wish more people would examine when they use these so-called complimentary terms, whether it's articulate or some other word, or people who say to Latinx people, oh, you speak English well, or I've heard my Asian friends say the same thing. Oh, well, where did you learn how to speak English so well? I don't know. My public school system in Sacramento? Maybe there? So, I mean, that's why I'm saying, well, articulate is sort of a black word in terms of the conversation. There's just a whole lot of times we all do this, where we have assumptions about how people are supposed to sound, and when it violates that assumption, we think we're paying them a compliment.
And I think that is, you said so many great things here. We really need to be cognizant of our assumptions and why are we thinking somebody is supposed to act or look like X or like Y or like Z. When we are thinking about the tapestry that is our society, it is a rich tapestry with diverse behaviors, perspectives, and sounds. There is not one way for any group, person, identity to sound like, look like. There are a whole bunch of people who talk differently, act differently, look differently, behave differently, have various mindsets and ideologies and perspectives that are rich. We actually cheat ourselves out of knowing each other and valuing each other. And I think if we're looking at this from a business perspective, getting the best out of each other when we are holding assumptions and stereotyping people, because we're not giving them a chance to show their whole range of talents. We've already put them into a box. and we've at some levels we can think lower of folks instead of telling them they can be all that they can be or giving them opportunities to show all what they can do, because we're saying, well, so and so is X, so they can only go this far, or I'm going to have to put them in a remedial position because I know that people who come from school X or neighborhood Y need more of some training or something else. Well, we don't know that. Each time we make an assumption, we are, in essence, cheapening the relationships and bonds we can be building with each other.
And that, Dr. Steve Bien-Aimé, and I know I botched that, despite 4 semesters of college French and a trip to Paris. But thank you, Steve. That was well said. You were well spoken, and you are highly articulate. That was Steve Bien-Aimé, Assistant Professor of Journalism at Northern Kentucky University. In our next episode, I'll talk to Curtis Tate, a biracial Vietnamese-American journalist, about how language contributes to anti-Asian violence. I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson. Thank you for listening to Race Unwrapped.
Race Unwrapped is produced by Michelle Tyreen Johnson. Our executive producer is Laura Ellis. Audio assistance from Eric Matthews. And music by Allison Cross. For more information, to contact us, or to support Race Unwrapped, visit wfpl.org/raceunwrapped. From LPM, Louisville Public Media.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.